Imagine standing in a showroom, staring at a motorcycle that looks more like it belongs on a MotoGP grid than on your driveway. That's the Honda RC213V-S of 2015, a street-legal machine born directly from Honda's World Championship racing program. It wasn't just another superbike painted with race-inspired graphics. It was, in essence, the DNA of Marc Marquez's RC213V MotoGP weapon, softened just enough to squeak past regulators. And that's where the intrigue begins, because this bike raised questions no ordinary production model ever dared to ask. How close could a factory really get to selling its Grand Prix machine to the public? How much performance could be unleashed on public asphalt without rewriting the rulebook? And what kind of statement does a six-figure, limited-run motorcycle make about Honda's ambitions, its engineering bravado, and the riders willing to pay the price of entry? On one hand, the RC213V-S was a tantalizing promise, a chance for ordinary enthusiasts, well, ordinary in budget terms, maybe extraordinary in passion, to touch the untouchable. On the other, it was a mirror held up to the motorcycle industry, reflecting just how wide the gulf had grown between showroom machines and the prototypes they were modeled after. To this day, the RC213V-S is remembered as an experiment, a gamble, and in some circles a masterpiece of engineering purity. And over the next stretch, we're going to unpack how it came to be, why Honda dared to build it, what compromises were forced into its design, and how its legacy still sparks debates among enthusiasts today. If that sounds like the kind of deep dive you enjoy, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what machine you want to see unraveled next. When Honda introduced the RC213V-S in 2015, the announcement stunned the motorcycle community because the company was offering something that had never been seen before: a MotoGP machine with lights, mirrors, and a license plate. This was not a marketing stunt dressed in racing graphics or a track bike repurposed for road use. This was the closest possible translation of Honda's RC213V prototype into a form that could legally roll down public streets. And for a brand like Honda, known for being conservative in its mass market production, that decision represented both a bold engineering showcase and a calculated risk. The story of the RC213V-S begins with context. By the early 2010s, racing technology had advanced so far beyond the reach of showroom sport bikes that fans were left dreaming about riding something even half as capable. Manufacturers would sell replicas with familiar names but watered-down hardware. Honda, however, wanted to make a statement that blurred the line between prototype and production. The RC213V-S was that statement, delivered with carbon fiber, titanium, and MotoGP-level suspension geometry. And yet, every piece of this story is complicated by compromise, regulation, and philosophy. Honda's engineers knew they couldn't simply drop a Grand Prix engine into a road bike. The emission standards alone would have killed that dream. Instead, the RC213V-S arrived in showrooms with a heavily detuned power figure that created confusion, even disappointment, among fans expecting raw MotoGP fury. But before we dive into those engineering trade-offs, it's worth understanding the background that led Honda to even attempt such a daring project. Reflection bridge. The RC213V-S was born not just from racing heritage, but also from an era where Honda wanted to remind the world of its dominance. Microstory, the seed of the RC213V-S. The foundation of the RC213V-S can be traced directly back to Honda's obsession with winning in MotoGP. In the 2010s, Honda's factory RC213V dominated circuits across the globe, racking up victories with a combination of explosive power and razor-sharp handling. Inside Honda's R&D centers, engineers and executives debated how to transfer that aura to everyday enthusiasts. The usual approach would have been a special edition of an existing sport bike. But a few insiders pushed the radical idea: build the closest possible street-legal version of the RC213V. That proposal was both audacious and risky. It would mean creating a motorcycle too expensive for mass sales but too specialized to ignore. When the green light was given, the RC213V-S was not meant to be a commercial success in numbers. It was meant to be a statement of supremacy, a bridge between the paddock and the public road. And that statement was about to come with a price tag that shocked the industry. Context Digest. Pricing strategy. At launch, the RC213V-S carried a base price around $184,000 in the US. That figure placed it well beyond the reach of most riders and instantly into collector territory. While rivals produced flagship sport bikes in the $15,000 to $30,000 range, Honda's MotoGP for the street cost more than many luxury cars. This deliberate pricing was not about volume, but about exclusivity. Honda wanted the RC213V-S to be an object of aspiration, a halo product that reinforced the brand's racing dominance. The price communicated that this was not just another motorcycle. It was a piece of MotoGP you could buy, microstory, engineering dilemmas. The core of the RC213V-S was its 999C V4 engine derived directly from the RC213V. But the engineers faced an impossible balancing act. Preserve as much of the prototype's DNA as possible while making it compliant with emissions laws and survivable in daily use. The result was a detuned version producing roughly 101 horsepower in US spec, far below expectations for a $184,000 motorcycle. Critics wondered why anyone would pay such a staggering sum for performance that could be matched by far cheaper machines. But Honda had a clever counter in the form of a power-up kit, an optional package that unleashed over 200 horsepower on track. This dual personality, tame on the street, ferocious with the kit, defined the RC213V-S and sparked endless debates about what it was truly meant to be. Reflection bridge. That tension between regulatory compliance and MotoGP authenticity shaped every discussion about the bike. Context digest. Production process. Unlike mass-produced motorcycles, the RC213V-S was hand-assembled in a special facility in Japan. Skilled technicians who normally worked on racing projects handled each build, ensuring levels of fit, finish, and attention that bordered on obsessive. Titanium bolts, carbon fiber bodywork, and magnesium wheels weren't optional add-ons, they were standard equipment. This meticulous production process limited how many units could realistically be built. Reports suggest fewer than 250 were ever produced worldwide, instantly making the RC213V-S one of the rarest Hondas ever sold. The small batch nature reinforced its status as a collector's dream and fueled speculation about long-term value. Microstory. Fan reactions. When the RC213V-S was revealed, reactions split into two camps. Enthusiasts and collectors celebrated the audacity of Honda for finally offering something so close to a MotoGP machine. But others felt betrayed by the detuned power figures, arguing that a $184,000 superbike should not be outgunned by models costing a fraction of the price. The optional power-up kit softened some criticism, but also highlighted the irony. The bike needed an aftermarket-style upgrade to unlock its full potential. This duality left the RC213V-S in a curious cultural space, admired as an engineering marvel, but criticized as impractical and inaccessible. That cultural debate became as central to its story as the motorcycle itself. Context digest. Regulation hurdles. The reason behind the detuned US version came down to regulatory differences. Europe and Japan allowed a slightly more powerful tune, but American emissions rules forced Honda to slash horsepower drastically. The disparity angered US buyers who felt shortchanged compared to overseas owners. It also underscored how difficult it was to reconcile MotoGP technology with public road legality. For Honda, the frustration wasn't just about paperwork. It was about trying to prove that its engineering dominance could extend into civilian life, only to have red tape dictate the outcome. Microstory, collectability, and speculation. Almost as soon as the RC213V-S was announced, speculation began about its long-term value. Collectors knew production would be limited, and the association with MotoGP gave it pedigree no ordinary sport bike could match. Many units were snapped up not by riders planning to put miles on them, but by investors expecting appreciation. Some bikes went straight from the crate to private collections, never to see asphalt. This dynamic fueled debates over whether the RC213V-S was truly a rider's dream or simply a financial asset dressed as a motorcycle. Either way, the scarcity and the controversy cemented its reputation as a unicorn in the market. And all of this brings us to the next stage in the journey: how the RC213V-S fit into Honda's broader philosophy of performance, prestige, and purpose. The RC213V-S was not simply about its spec sheet. It was about what Honda was trying to say with its existence, and in that way, the RC213V-S of 2015 represented one of the boldest philosophical experiments in motorcycling history. While Segment 1 centered on the birth of the project and its initial reception, the deeper story is found in the decisions that shaped its execution and the ripple effects those decisions created in the motorcycle community. Honda, a company typically associated with reliability and mass-market accessibility, suddenly asked riders to consider it as a producer of ultra-rare, ultra-expensive exotica. That tension gave the RC213V-S a cultural weight that far exceeded the number of units built. If Segment 1 left us with questions about why Honda pursued such a path, this stretch reveals how those answers collided with reality. Micro-story. A statement beyond sales. Within Honda, the RC213V-S was never intended to be a profit engine. The cost of development, hand assembly, and regulatory compliance almost certainly outweighed the revenue from a few hundred units sold. Instead, Honda treated the project as a public declaration of its MotoGP dominance. Each RC213V-S was essentially a rolling banner that said, "We can do this. We can give you the closest thing to a race bike, and nobody else will go this far." The company was willing to absorb financial inefficiency in exchange for prestige. That message was as important internally, to remind employees and engineers of the brand's DNA, as it was externally to consumers. But prestige is fragile, and the bike's reception proved more complicated. Context digest. Market comparisons. At the time of its release, no other manufacturer was offering a machine so close to prototype technology. Other superbikes reached 200 horsepower and boasted electronic aids, but they were mass-produced, priced under $30,000, and designed for thousands of customers. The RC213V-S, by contrast, was priced at nearly 10 times that amount, hand-built, and aimed at a niche of collectors and diehards. This separation set Honda apart but also invited skepticism. Some enthusiasts questioned whether exclusivity was a true benefit or simply an exclusionary tactic. For the broader market, the RC213V-S highlighted the gap between what manufacturers could build and what they were willing to sell at scale. Micro-story. The paradox of performance. The biggest criticism leveled at the RC213V-S was the mismatch between price and street horsepower. In the US, with its restricted 101 horsepower tune, the bike offered less output than Honda's own mass-market machines costing 1/10 as much. On paper, that made no sense. But when fitted with the optional race kit, the RC213V-S delivered over 200 horsepower and dynamics far sharper than any showroom bike. The paradox lay in legality. Honda had to sell it in neutered form to comply with regulations, but it was the same hardware that, once unleashed, would terrify even seasoned track riders. This dual reality created a mystique. Owning one meant you held a key to a hidden side of MotoGP, even if you never used it. Reflection bridge. The RC213V-S embodied both the thrill of ultimate performance and the frustration of ultimate compromise. Context digest. Engineering authenticity. Beyond the engine, what separated the RC213V-S was its chassis and components. It used a frame geometry nearly identical to the MotoGP machine, Öhlins race-spec suspension, Brembo brakes of the highest grade, and exotic materials rarely seen outside factory teams. Riding one wasn't about horsepower bragging rights. It was about experiencing how a MotoGP bike carried itself through a corner, how it flicked side to side, and how it responded to inputs. For those lucky enough to ride it, the feedback and agility were unlike anything in mass production. This was Honda's ace. Even if detuned, the RC213V-S felt unlike any other motorcycle you could legally own. Microstory. The rider's dilemma. Those few who did ride the RC213V-S faced a strange dilemma. On one hand, it was intoxicating, a sensation of connection and sharpness that spoiled them for anything else. On the other, every mile put on the odometer risked diminishing a collectible asset worth six figures. Many owners hesitated, torn between enjoying the machine for what it was and preserving it for future value. Some split the difference, riding sparingly, often on private tracks. Others kept theirs in climate-controlled garages. This tension between passion and preservation became part of the RC213V-S's identity. It wasn't just a motorcycle. It was a decision point about what ownership meant. Context digest. Cultural perception. In the US, the RC213V-S became a kind of litmus test. Riders who valued exclusivity saw it as a holy grail, proof that Honda could play in the same ultra-rare territory as Italian exotics. Others mocked it as a wasteful exercise, a neutered MotoGP bike locked behind a price wall. This split perception echoed through forums, publications, and even trackside conversations. Unlike a mass-market model where consensus forms easily, the RC213V-S thrived on controversy. That controversy kept it relevant far longer than most limited-run machines, which often fade into quiet obscurity. Microstory: collectors and investors. Over time, the market for RC213V-S units revealed another layer. Collectors treated it as art, while investors tracked auction results closely. Values initially dipped slightly after launch, then began climbing as the rarity became apparent. By the early 2020s, pristine examples had already exceeded their original asking prices at auction. This confirmed what many suspected. The RC213V-S was not just a riding experience, but also a financial vehicle. The motorcycle became part of an elite class of machines that straddled the line between functional engineering and speculative asset. Owning one meant holding a piece of Honda history, with a market that validated the decision. Reflection bridge. The RC213V-S forced people to ask whether motorcycles are meant to be ridden or displayed, and no single answer satisfied everyone. Microstory: the regulatory irony. Perhaps the most bitter irony in the RC213V-S story is that emissions and noise rules shaped its reputation as much as engineering did. In countries with looser restrictions, the bike's true character shone through more vividly. In the US, the detuned version cast a long shadow, leaving many to associate it with underwhelming numbers despite its track potential. This regulatory mismatch illustrated the global challenge of translating prototype technology into road-legal form. It also demonstrated how fragile the balance is between government rules and engineering ambition. Honda had to play by the book, even if it meant frustrating its most passionate customers. And it is here, in the interplay between law, engineering, and culture, that we begin to understand the legacy the RC213V-S carved out for itself. The story now moves toward its lasting impact, and how this singular experiment continues to echo in the motorcycle world today. The RC213V-S of 2015 was more than just a limited production superbike. It was a statement that continues to ripple through the motorcycle industry, and the legacy of the RC213V-S is still debated almost a decade later. If earlier stretches focused on why it was built and how it was received, the real question now becomes, what impact did it leave? And how does it shape the way we think about motorcycles today? For Honda, the RC213V-S served as proof that its engineering could leap the boundary between prototype and production. For riders and collectors, it became a mirror that revealed what they valued most: riding purity, investment potential, or simply the prestige of owning something almost nobody else could. And for the industry at large, it raised an uncomfortable but important point. Is it possible or even desirable to bring prototype-level machines into the public domain? Microstory: influence on future projects. After the RC213V-S, no other major manufacturer immediately attempted something so extreme, but the bike influenced the way brands talked about their flagship models. Marketing increasingly leaned on phrases like race-derived and prototype DNA, even when the hardware was far removed from the grid. The RC213V-S made those claims harder to dismiss because Honda had shown what the genuine article looked like. It reset the benchmark for authenticity and branding, even if no one else was ready to follow the same costly path. The shadow it cast changed the language of high-performance motorcycles in subtle but lasting ways. Context digest: ownership reality. For the few US buyers who managed to acquire an RC213V-S, ownership meant navigating contradictions. Insurance companies often struggled to categorize it, maintenance required specialized attention, and parts were not as easily available as with regular Hondas. Many owners treated their bikes more like fine art than transportation, rarely registering them for the road. The bike's actual road presence in America remained almost mythical, with most sightings coming from track events or carefully orchestrated appearances. This rarity enhanced its aura but also underscored how disconnected it was from the average rider's world. Microstory: media myth-making. Journalists who had the chance to ride the RC213V-S often described the experience as otherworldly, even when bound by track restrictions. The sharpness of the steering, the feedback through the chassis, and the way it carried speed mid-corner left lasting impressions. These ride reports became part of the lore, circulating online and in magazines as testaments to the bike's purity. Even critics of its price or detuning acknowledge that once experienced at pace, the RC213V-S offered a glimpse into MotoGP that no other street bike could match. This storytelling ensured that the bike's legend grew far beyond the small number of units produced. Context, digest, auction, and legacy. By the early 2020s, RC213V-S units appearing at auction fetched eye-watering sums, sometimes well above the original $184,000 sticker. Collectors framed them as blue-chip investments, similar to limited-run Ferraris or rare Porsches. Honda had unwittingly created a motorcycle that transcended its category and entered the realm of financial collectibles. This reality reinforced the paradox of the RC213V-S. A bike designed to bring racing to the street became more likely to live behind glass than under a rider. And yet, that very paradox is part of what makes its story enduring. Microstory, symbol of ambition. Within Honda's long history, the RC213V-S stands apart as an experiment in ambition. The company had nothing to prove commercially. Its mass-market motorcycles were strong sellers. Instead, the RC213V-S was a cultural signal, a reminder that Honda's dominance in MotoGP was not an accident, but the product of relentless engineering. By putting even a sliver of that dominance into customer hands, the company elevated its image in ways that advertising never could. It was less about selling motorcycles and more about cementing identity. That symbolic role ensures that the RC213V-S remains an essential chapter in the Honda story. Reflection bridge. The RC213V-S asked whether motorcycles are tools for everyday mobility, vessels of passion, or objects of art, and the answer varied depending on who held the keys. Microstory. The debate continues. Even today, enthusiasts argue about whether the RC213V-S was worth it. Was it a neutered MotoGP bike robbed of its true character? Or was it the purest glimpse civilians could ever get of prototype machinery? Some see it as an overpriced collector trap. Others as a once-in-a-lifetime offering that proved a manufacturer could put integrity over mass appeal. This debate is part of why the RC213V-S has remained relevant long after its production run ended. Unlike most limited-run machines, which fade into trivia, the RC213V-S continues to ignite conversation because it sits at the crossroads of engineering, culture, and aspiration. And as we reflect on that debate, we begin to see how the RC213V-S shaped expectations for what motorcycles could be. The final step is to pull all these threads together into one lasting perspective on why this machine matters to US riders and what its legacy tells us about the future. The Honda RC213V-S of 2015 stands as one of the most polarizing motorcycles ever offered to the public. And as we close this exploration, it's worth stepping back to see what it really means. At its core, the RC213V-S was a paradox. A MotoGP bike built for the street, but bound by laws that stripped much of its power in the US. A handcrafted engineering marvel that many buyers never actually rode, and a six-figure investment that blurred the line between machine and art. In practical terms, most riders in America never even saw one outside of a magazine feature, let alone felt its handling or heard its exhaust note. The ownership reality was one of exclusivity, insurance hurdles, limited dealer support, and the constant tug-of-war between riding and preserving value. For the average enthusiast, it was less about the possibility of buying one and more about knowing that such a thing existed. Proof that Honda was capable of building something far beyond the reach of mainstream sport bikes. Yet that distance from everyday reality is exactly why the RC213V-S is remembered so vividly. It was not about practicality. It was about possibility. By daring to translate its MotoGP prototype into a street-legal package, however compromised, Honda set a benchmark that reshaped the way manufacturers talk about technology transfer. Every time you hear race-derived in an ad today, the ghost of the RC213V-S lingers in the background, reminding us what true race-derived really looks like. In the US context, the bike also offered a sharp lesson about regulation and perception. No matter how advanced the engineering, the rules of the road and the limits of legality would always have the final say. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the RC213V-S is the way it forced riders and collectors alike to confront their own values. Is a motorcycle meant to be ridden, even at the expense of rarity and resale? Or is it meant to be preserved, admired, and treated like a museum piece? There is no single answer, and that's why the debates continue nearly a decade later. For Honda, the RC213V-S remains a symbol of ambition and pride, an experiment that sacrificed profit for prestige and succeeded in carving out a unique place in motorcycle history. For American riders, it stands as both an unattainable dream and a conversation starter about what motorcycles can be when limits are pushed to their edge. In the end, the RC213V-S wasn't just about selling a machine, it was about making a statement. And that statement echoes every time we imagine what it would feel like to truly ride a MotoGP bike on the street. That is the lasting gift of the Honda RC213V-S. Not just a machine you could buy, but a reminder of how far imagination, engineering, and passion can go when they meet on two wheels.